Lovely. All right. So what I'll try to do this morning is to actually complement very much what Guyu and Matthias have said already, right? So we got a very comprehensive legal analysis from Guyu. We got the policy picture from Matthias. What I will do is try to fill in some things from my side and also discuss with you some projects that I am currently coordinating for the purpose of answering some of the very difficult questions that we are facing today. So that's why title of my talk is on the multi-level governance of space resources and celestial bodies, because as it was already said many times, and I cannot underline this more, it is not possible to discuss just space resources. We need to discuss what we want to do with celestial bodies and how do we want to use them. It only makes sense from a very theoretical perspective to talk only about space resources. If we want to be practical, we got to have other things in mind, like power, landing, and many other things. So it is very important to focus on what do we do with the moon, what do we do with Mars, rather than just one resource. So to do that, I'll go a little bit into a more, let's say, practical context of what are we actually talking about, right? Because it is not that space resources suddenly appeared on our agenda or even in the agenda of space agencies yesterday, right? This is something that it's not new in itself, but the way we want to do it in the future is what will make a difference. And then based on that, I will also discuss some of the projects that I am coordinating at the moment to solve, or at least try to discuss these kind of questions. So in terms of context, right, we already know that space resource activities have happened. So this is one thing that probably people who are not familiar with this topic will not think about, but we need to establish that space resource activities have already happened. They actually have been one of the very first space activities ever conducted in 1969. When the Apollo astronauts landed on the moon, the very first thing they did, it was collecting lunar rocks. So the purpose was to study them. The purpose was to utilize them for scientific purposes. But it technically, and I would say legally speaking, this qualifies as a space resource activity because a human being went on another celestial body, took some of the resources, owned them, brought them back on Earth, and they were utilized for scientific purposes, right? So this is a space resource activity. And nobody claimed that this was illegal. Nobody said that this was against the non-appropriation principle. It is important to remind that the Outer Space Treaty was already in force from 1967. So this was done with the knowledge of the entire space community, and I would say in full compliance with the legal framework that is still valid today. The best proof of this is that other countries engaged in this kind of activities. The last one being China, with the Chang'e 5 mission, the rover landed on the moon, took some resources and brought them back on Earth. And I think they were recently displayed and shared with the international community to do scientific research again. And this time it was done robotically because of course it is much more cost efficient, but to a certain extent, it is the same thing. It's a country making use of the freedom to explore and use celestial bodies, as you already mentioned before, to take some of the resources, extracting them in this case, or collecting them in place. None of these countries is bound by the Moon Agreement, so it doesn't really make any difference from them, whether they are collecting or extracting, it's the same thing, and then bring them back. Now, it is for sure important to underline that these activities have been done for scientific purposes, right? And so one may say that other countries did not protest because there was no commercial purpose behind. But in itself, the freedom to use celestial bodies is not bound by scientific purposes. It is a very broad freedom. It could be used for scientific purposes. This has been the most important use, but nothing in the treaty prevents a country to utilize space for commercial purposes. And this has already happened. Another thing that we usually tend to forget is that space is an industry, right? And nobody's going to telecommunication companies telling them to share part of their revenues that they make for telecommunication activities. With space resources, we have a sort of a different approach because it is much more tangible, right? It's not just using the spectrum, it's using a resource, which is exhausting some of them. And so in this case, we feel that we have to have other mechanisms. But in itself, we need to also be mindful that there are other activities happening for commercial purposes, and nobody's going to make a big deal of it, actually. So this is what happened so far. This is what we can call a traditional type of space resource activity. We visit a celestial body, we take some of the resources, bring them back, then we use them for scientific purposes, or we sell them to people that collect these kind of things. It doesn't really make a big difference from a legal perspective. And of course, there are other missions we could mention. There is the fantastic Hayabusa program from Japan, but I'm not going into many details today. Now, there are also new types of space resource activities happening as we speak. Again, in this picture, you see on the left, the Chang'e 4 rover from the Chinese National Space Administration. And then on the right, you see the Perseverance rover. Now, the difference between these two missions and the previous ones is that they're not just collecting resources, they're using them, they're processing them, transforming them for a specific purpose. So it is a kind of a one step forward. The Chang'e 4 demonstrated that plants can actually sprout and grow on the lunar surface, on the far side of the moon, which is a fundamental component of any kind of program that we want to have on the moon. Even just robotic programs, we need to make use of resources. This time, it was not actual space resources, it was resources brought from Earth, but the technology demonstrates that we can use them, and then we can make use of those resources plus the resources we have on the moon to make a biosphere, for instance, right? There are actual programs working on this. And the Perseverance rover has already demonstrated on Mars last year the production of oxygen from the Martian atmosphere. So breaking down the carbon dioxide into oxygen and carbon oxygen, they created oxygen that could be breathable for astronauts, that could be used for growing plants. And this is a transformative space resource activity. So it goes one step forward from the collection of resources, but it still belongs to the same genus, right? And again, these activities have happened without anybody going to NASA or to CNSA and saying, oh, this is illegal under the Outer Space Treaty, or this is appropriation, or you cannot transform resources. Again, of course, caveat is that we're doing this with very small quantities. Nobody is really concerned if we take a couple of particles from the Martian atmosphere and we turn them into oxygen. If we do it with the entire planet, that would be a much more different question. But still, legally speaking, the activity is happening. And it is a necessary one. It is one that the legal framework is trying to enable and support, because without these activities, and this is something that we also need to keep in mind, sustainable exploration will be almost impossible, right? Because if we have to bring all resources we need for space exploration with us, then the cost will be simply inaccessible for maybe 99% of the countries on Earth, right? So space resources activities are actually in the best interest of those countries who cannot afford big programs for space exploration, because if they cannot use the resources, then they essentially have no other way to get into deep space exploration and even further to settlements and other type of programs. Now, the even step forward to the utilization of space resources is to integrate them in ambitious international programs for the development of settlements and bases on the moon, right? So you see in this slide, the Artemis plan, which is about developing a permanent basis on the south pole of the moon, which will be both robotic and crewed. And then you see, of course, the International Lunar Research Station, which is more of a scientific program, but also aims to have a sustainable presence on the moon for the exclusive purpose of doing science. But again, doesn't really make a difference in the sense that these programs rely and depend on the fact that we can use resources, that we can make use of the resources that we have on the moon to sustain this kind of presence, to build structure. Imagine we want to build a base on the moon. It doesn't really make much sense to bring all the materials with us. We can use the lunar regolith, which is also much better for radiation shielding, for instance, right? We can use the lava tubes. The purpose is, let's be integrated with the environment that we have. And so that is even a step forward for space resources. We talk about collection, we talk about processing. This is about incorporation. It is actual transformation of the resource to make a new thing, to create a new object, which wouldn't even be a space object. It would be a space-made product, as the Hague Working Group proposed a new definition that we need to then fit into the legal framework of international space law. So going from the Apollo astronauts collecting 20 kilos of lunar rocks to the Artemis program and the ILRS program integrating space resources for the development of settlements, then this is where the legal framework is tested. This is where we have new questions. And this is why we're discussing this kind of things. Because if we would continue to just take a couple of resources from other planets and bring them back, we wouldn't really need a governance framework. We wouldn't really need any kind of legal discussion, because these things are clearly legal. They have happened. They will continue to happen. But in order to use a large quantity of resources for the purpose of creating new products, new settlements in space and on celestial bodies, that's where the question comes. That's where the legal framework is more tested, and that's where we need new mechanisms. So the question is not about if we can do it, but how do we do it? It's about how much resources you can take, for how long you can stay, how much you have to share, compatibility with the principle of free access. you name them. So this is why we're going now from a legal framework, which we do have. This is also important to state for people, especially who are not familiar with this kind of discussion. It is not that we do not have a legal framework. We do have a legal framework. We have international space law, and we have implementing legislation at the national level. You already summed that up very brilliantly, so I don't need to go into much details, but there are principles that are applicable to these activities. It's not that they are happening without any regulation or without any control. There is no specific rule for space resource activities, but there are many that will apply, and examples of that are laid down in the foundational principles of the Aerospace Treaty. This is a matrix that I developed for some of the classes that I teach in Luxembourg, and I think it's quite helpful in summarizing very quickly what do you need to take from the Aerospace Treaty that will apply to space resource activities. And the most important one for me, I will not go into details today, is the due regard principle, right? Under Article 9 of the Aerospace Treaty, countries have to pay due regard to the corresponding interests of other countries. They have to consult if there is a potential interference. They have to non-harmfully contaminate celestial bodies. That is already a rule, and a very specific one, right? So if a country is taking all the resources on the South Pole of the moon, then another country could claim a violation of the due regard principle. Right? If a country is stepping on another experiment conducted on the moon, then a country may violate, in doing so, Article 9 of the Aerospace Treaty. So there are rules that we can apply and that we will apply. The point is that these rules are not enough when we increase the frequency of these activities. If it's only 2 countries doing a one-time activity on the moon, then we can work with these rules, and that's what we will do over the next 5 years, because it is not likely that we will come up with new rules right now. But when we have a much complex environment where there are many countries interacting, where we have companies, where we have other scientific institutions, then these rules are not enough. They are a starting point, but they need more. So to a certain extent, this gap can be filled by implementing legislation. This is why countries like the United States or Luxembourg, and more recently UAE and Japan, they have enacted national laws, because they need to tell to their companies and to their scientific institutions even what they can do, right? How do you perform these kind of activities in compliance with international space law? This is their duty, actually, under Article 6 of the Aerospace Treaty. They have to authorize and supervise, and to do that, they need a framework. So that's why some of these gaps can be filled and are already being filled at the national level. The problem is, though, as you said, that we need international consensus on this, right? It's not that every country will come up with a different way to do space resource activities, because otherwise conflict and tensions will arise inevitably. So we need some guidance at the international level. That's where the key discussions are happening at the moment. So we're going from a pure, simple legal framework to a governance system. That's what we need at the moment. And governance system doesn't have to scare anybody. It's not that we will come up tomorrow with a set of detailed rules on how to do space resource activities. What we need is a way to govern these activities in a multi-level way, because it is clear that we cannot do this only at the international level, but we cannot also do it only at the national level. We need a multi-level governance system where certain things will be done by countries at the national level, other things will be delegated to international discussions that we have already in Corpus. We need a system that is adaptive, because we do not know actually how to do these activities on a large scale or a permanent way. We need to learn, and in order to learn, we need to have a system that can evolve. If tomorrow we sign an international agreement on space resource utilization, and then we find out that we didn't understand how to do space resources, what do we do with this treaty, right? Can we change it? It's very complicated. So before spending a lot of political energies into negotiating a treaty, we need to be sure that what we have is pretty good understanding. And so until then, we need adaptive mechanisms to say, okay, let's start with this, we see how it goes, then we reevaluate and we change. Once we have accumulated some years of experience, I would say, then we can say, okay, we're sure enough about this to put it in a treaty. And finally, a governance system needs to be comprehensive, in the sense that we discussed before. It is not that you can only say, okay, well, let's regulate space resources because everybody is really sensitive about it, and let's forget about how do we generate power on the moon, or how do we store resources, how do we transport them, and things like that, right? this has to be a more comprehensive discussion. We cannot only discuss space resources. We need to see, what do we do with the celestial body? What do we do with the conflict between science and commerce? What do we do if a country wants to perform a scientific investigation on the far side of the moon, which is actually very good for science and radio astronomy, and another one has a company that wants to do business there? And who says who gets that? And eventually, how do we balance? So we need to think about this kind of questions, and not just, can you own 20 kilos of lunar rocks, or 50 or 100, right? It is more comprehensive discussion. So in order to kind of help assessing some of these questions and developing this governance system, which I think we need, for me, it's not even a question of if, it's when and how do we develop, but we will need some sort of governance system. Then I will just briefly share some of the projects that I am coordinating with some international colleagues. So the very first one is the basics, right? Let's start simple, and let's start with information, because that's what we all need to make sure that we can have peaceful, safe, and sustainable uses of celestial bodies. If you have countries performing activities on the moon, which is a very also small body, and they don't talk to each other, and they don't say to each other what are they doing and how are they doing it and when and for what purpose, then it will be simply impossible to properly coordinate. Tensions and conflicts will be just a matter of time, simply because it is in our human nature. And second, because the dynamics, the physics of the moon will create issues. And so if we do not say to each other, hey, by the way, I'm going to be on the South Pole doing this scientific experiment, be mindful that if you spread lunar dust over my experiment, it will be screwed up. So please don't do it, right? Or purpose of safety or coordination zones. If you're coming through this area, please let me know so that I can avoid interference with you and with me, right? The purpose is, let's talk to each other. And this is actually very basic. We don't even need to have a new legal framework. We don't even need a new governance system for that, because information sharing is already embodied within the Outer Space Treaty. It is in Article 11. There is a mechanism for states to inform the United Nations Secretary General, so a neutral entity, of the activities, the location, the result, the duration, the conduct, the nature of the activities they conduct in outer space and on celestial bodies. So this is at the core of a project that I am co-chairing with Mark Sandel, Professor Mark Sandel, who spoke at this event earlier before. And it's about the use of Article 11 for the purpose of sharing information about lunar activities. And we believe that the use of Article 11, which has been neglected over the last 50 years for a number of reasons, of course, should come into play, because it is a mechanism that works. If you really think about it, it is simple. It already has a system that works. We already have a database even of information shared under Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty. We have an office, which is the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. We have everything we need to start. The only thing that it's missing at the moment, and I think we can change that, is the political will to use it, right? But I believe countries will understand, and especially companies actually, that it is in their best interest to share information about the activities for transparency purposes and avoiding any kind of questioning about the peaceful nature of these activities, but also to avoid harmful interference and enable operators to act with due regard to the respect of interest of other parties. Now, the Article 11 project came out of a much longer discussion on registration mechanisms for lunar activities, to which Guyu, for instance, took part extensively, and I want to thank him for that. So that was another project. But the purpose of this one is to focus on one thing, which is the use of Article 11. Now, the only problem that we found when we look at how do we use this article is that the template that you find on UNOSA website, it's quite old, in the sense that it's a very basic template. It doesn't help us in providing the right type of information that we need for coordination. So with Mark, what we've done, and also at the end of the registration project, was to see, okay, what type of information we need to ensure safety and sustainability of lunar activities. And then let's develop a new template, or let's say an enhanced version of the template that we have on the UNOSA website to support states and operators in doing that. And so this is an example of it, but we have, I think, something like 11 sections, which are about, what kind of information you can share and how do you do that? What do you put in this template? And we have things that are very basic, like please give us the coordinates or where you're going and how long are you planning to stay. It's not that we're going into share specific information that may be covered by national security or intellectual property rights. The purpose is not to go that detailed, but we do not need to go that detailed in order to ensure basic coordination mechanism, right? So this project is really something that we are investing a lot on because we think that it's as simple as effective, and sometimes those are the most useful solution. So we also complemented the project with instructions in the sense that we give definition of terms, right? What do you mean with coordinates? What do we mean with the purpose of what is a target body and things like that to simplify the understanding of the template. And of course, if you're interested in learning more about that with Mark, we'll be happy to talk through, and we'll set up a website pretty soon so you can find also the template on our website online. Information sharing is also at the core of the activities that we're doing with the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities that you mentioned before. I have the privilege of chairing subgroup number 1, which is on information sharing. And with subgroup 1, we're kind of complementing this work with the development of protocols, data sets, and proposals for dedicated institutions for the purpose of not only sharing, but also reviewing the information. Because again, that's the next step, right? Once we know that there are 2 activities happening on the south pole of the moon at the same time in the same area, then we need a way to do something with this information. Now, there is already a mechanism, Article 9 of the Aerospace Treaty, the principle of consultation, but it's not that we really have done it a lot, and we have never done it for celestial bodies. So the purpose of subgroup 1 would be to say, this is one way where countries can sit down and talk through eventual conflict or simply things that they want to discuss about the information shared for lunar activities. And so this is a way to complement further the discussion with opportunities to talk to each other. This is the most important thing, actually, because it's not that at the moment, we cannot come up with very detailed rules. I can tell you that space resource activities can take 20 years or 50 years or 20 kilometers or 50. These numbers will change. What we need at the moment is a place where we can talk about these things. And of course, the Space Resources Working Group in Corpus is a great start to that end, but it is also a very sensitive arena for countries to disclose and share positions. It is very diplomatically focused. It has a specific work plan. We need also a place to discuss these things from a technical perspective, right? From a more practical perspective. That's where GEXLA can complement the work of the Space Resources Working Group in Corpus. Second thing, and I'll wrap it up pretty soon because I see that time is running and we want to go to the panel discussion, of course. It's a next step. So information sharing for me is a very basic. I really do not see how we can say that we do not need that. Next step is, how do we actually build these governance systems, right? How do we go from principles and rules and guidelines to something that we can call a governance system? In my view, and in the view of Space Generation Advisory Council, which I have the honor to represent in this instance, we need something that is a new document, something that we call governance charters. And governance charters are meant to stay between international space law and national legislation as a sort of intermediate framework that will allow us to specify a little bit more the principles of the Aerospace Treaty to give guidance for the development of national legislation. So this is an incremental process, right? At the moment, we know that under Article 1 of the Aerospace Treaty, you can use celestial bodies, but you also need to guarantee free access to all areas of celestial bodies. Now, how do we go from that to the development of a lunar base? What are the principles that we need to keep in mind when doing that? You do not find the answer in Article 1. The answers will start with Article 1, but it needs something more specific for the purpose of the moon or the Mars or an asteroid, which cannot also be in national legislation because we need some sort of international understanding. That's why governance charters could be a solution for that. You can call them as you like, really. We really like the term charter because it has not been used so far in the space community. But the purpose is, let's have a sort of intermediate document, which does not have to be a treaty. I want to stress that very much. It doesn't have to be legally binding, but it's a document where we all agree, something like the Artemis Accords, but broader. Because the Artemis Accords refer to the Artemis partners. It's only meant to regulate the Artemis program. And so some countries that will not participate in the Artemis program maybe don't want to sign the Artemis Accords, but they might sign up to something similar that gives us a more specific principle level understanding on how do we interpret and implement the Outer Space Treaty. This has been developed by the EAGLE team, and EAGLE stands for Effective and Adaptive Governance for a Lunar Ecosystem. It's a specialized division of Space Generation Advisory Council, which is the largest network of students and young professionals in the space community in the world. We have more than 16,000 members, and we are affiliated with the UN. So the purpose of SGC is to voice the position of the young generation before the United Nations. In this case, the EAGLE team is the representative of SGC for the purpose of lunar governance. And we developed a report. If you scan the QR code, you should be able to download it from our website, on SGC website. And we developed a report in this lunar governance report, which we also developed thanks to the kind help of GUYU, but also LSA and Matthias. We had a lot of discussion on this kind of things, right? And the purpose of the report is to provide a snapshot of what is the policy landscape for lunar governance. And then based on that, what is the position of the young generation on this? And one of the things that we came up is the idea of a lunar governance charter, which can be an aspirational document, of course, not something that we will develop tomorrow, but something to keep in mind, because we need something. Again, we need a document where we can put this kind of principle level understanding. And we believe that if we call it charter, it's more solemn. It doesn't have to be binding again, but it has to be something that we all agree it's important. We all agree it's needed. And for the moon, we all agree it's fundamental. This is just to give you an example of the kind of discussions we have in the charter. We have 12 principles, and the purpose of this principle is to show how do we imagine a charter being actually composed. We didn't want to just say, let's do a charter and then leave the burden to the others. We said, okay, this is one way we can do it. Again, those are just proposals. We presented the EAGLE report and the proposal for a charter before COPE was the legal subcommittee last year in June. To the attention of the delegation. So those are just suggestions, like the building blocks, but something that we want to keep in mind. For instance, a lunar governance charter should enable interoperability, prioritize human life protection, develop a mechanism for protecting heritage sites, and things like that. So in the report, you can find a more detailed explanation of why do we think we need each and every one of those. And of course, there is information sharing as part of the one of the fundamental principles that we need to keep in mind. So in conclusion, what we need to do at the moment, and this is a very complicated challenge, is to go from regulation to governance, because regulation is good once we have established what rules we want to have. And right now we do not have that certainty, we do not have that knowledge. So we more than rules, specific rules, which we will need at some level, we need a way to govern this situation. We need a way to make sure that if there is a discussion that we want to have, if someone thinks that this principle is wrong, we can discuss it in a way that is institutionalized, that is dedicated for that, and that is also effective. So of course, and that's why another reason why COPUS is fundamental, but it cannot be the only body. COPUS meets once a year. So the legal subcommittee meets in April, and that's done. So if you have an issue in September, where do you go? Do you have to wait for another session of COPUS? Or is there another way to complement this kind of discussions in a way that we can govern these activities dynamically? That's why in subgroup 1 of GEXA, we're thinking about proposal for institutions, because we need something that can be there when we need it and not just once a year. So those are kind of things that complement each other, again, not replace each other. But we need different institutions covering and fulfilling different functions. So that's why we need governance and not just rules. Information sharing is a starting point for that. Without information, we're not going anywhere meaningfully, at least. We're just blind, and when one is blind, it's just not going anywhere. And then governance charter are a proposal for a more medium-term approach, right? Something that we will need to come up. The working group, for instance, terminology is developing principles eventually, right? So you can call them principles. It's not really in the name has a sort of relevance for us as the new generation. We wanted to also give some new terminology, new blood in the discussion, but it really is more what do we have in the document and what is the purpose. And we will need this sort of intermediate document that is shared by everyone. So not just a group of countries, which is good, but it's not enough, right? So we need something that is more broader and developed hopefully by COPUS. So by building on these pillars, we probably will be able to result in something like this. It's a beautiful rendering from the MIT Media Lab, the SOM, LLP, and the European Space Agency. It's a rendering of a moon village, right? Something that looks very peaceful, where you do not only have space resource activities, you have habitats, you have every kind of technology you need to sustain presence on the moon. And I think really the difference between this vision and the current desolation that we have on the moon, the beautiful desolation that Buzz Aldrin defined, lies really in the role of space lawyers and policy people, because this is the moment where we can come up with the right rules and processes to enable this kind of vision. If we are too stubborn or too simply scared to be bold to a certain extent, then probably this vision will never be real. And so hopefully in 10 years, we will have another edition of this event and see how it went. Thank you all very much.